Greetings everyone. Welcome to another episode of Hard Talk HR. I'm your host, Mihaly. My guest today is Siobhan McHale, the Executive General Manager of HR at Dulux Group in Melbourne, Australia. Siobhan also is the author of The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. So we asked Siobhan to come on camera and talk about, obviously, culture. What is culture in the first place? How to go about successful culture transformation? And what are the typical pitfalls she has seen organizations commit that stops them to achieve lasting culture transformation? And especially in today's times when most of our viewers are in their home office due to the global pandemic, preserving the right culture is very important. And this is also a good time to take a good look and a close look at our culture and prepare for culture change in a post-pandemic era, so we are able to develop and deliver the right culture that supports the organizations to win at the marketplace. If you like today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Visit our podcast pages on Spreaker and Spotify. At Hard Talk HR, we bring you fresh ideas and inspiring content from around the world of work. Siobhan, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's such a delight, such a privilege having you here with me. Your latest book, your book is out now, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change. And this book has a fascinating subtitle, Creating a Workplace that Delivers, Grows and Adapts. Well, there's probably no better time to talk about adaptation in the workplace when most organizations are impacted massively by the coronavirus pandemic. And especially when they're sort of going through some sort of a culture change, this is a time to talk about how to adapt to the current situation, how to create and craft the right culture that supports the organization and execution capabilities. However, before we get there, there are several quotes saying that culture eats strategy for breakfast, or culture trumps strategy all the time. So there is kind of an alignment. There's no disagreement on how important culture is when it comes to the organizational capability on executing on strategy. But there's certainly a disagreement on what culture is in the first place. So let's start by defining culture. In your own views, what is culture?
Yeah, thank you, and great to be talking with you today, Mihaly. And I would probably add that culture enables strategy rather than competes with strategy. It's a key enabler for your strategic intent, and at its heart is the patterns of relating between the parts that determine how the organization functions. So if the behaviors are at the individual level, the patterns are at the collective level. And it's almost the difference between the dancers and the dance. The dancers are the behaviors, and we often focus on the dancers, but we don't always see the dance. So the unwritten rules are the patterns that determine how that workplace functions.
So, Siobhan, if I understand correctly, what you're suggesting, if you really want to understand culture, you need to be able to understand the underlying patterns. But those patterns, more often than not, invisible. So how shall we recognize those patterns that determine the culture?
I can give you a practical example. I worked with a team for 7 years at the ANZ Bank in Australia, and after 3 years I became head of the organisation's culture change effort. And essentially when I walked in, I noticed that there was a lot of noise in the organisation, and we did a diagnostic and we discovered that there was a deeply embedded pattern where the branch staff were in role of order takers and the head office was in role of order givers. And there was a pattern of relatedness between them, which was that you would be told what to do around here, which was leading to very poor customer satisfaction. In fact, the lowest levels of customer satisfaction in the country. And in fact, the bank was one of the poorest performing banks in the country. 7 years later, that situation had changed and it became the highest performing bank in the country and one of the best performing banks in the world. In fact, the number one bank on the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And essentially, we changed that pattern of relatedness between the branches. So we reframed their role from order takers to service providers to the customer. And then we reframed the role of the head office to be support giver to the branches. And a new pattern of relatedness started to develop between those two parts, which was that we worked together to service our customers. And it became the number one bank for customer service as well in the country.
Fascinating insights, Siobhan. Thank you so much for sharing. Before I hit the record button, we were chatting about the current coronavirus situation we're all experiencing, and people around the world are impacted. This is a real test of enduring organization culture. This is a real test of the organization itself, how the company is able to survive and potentially come out stronger from this current adversity. Many organizations are or have been embarking on culture change or are planning embarking on culture change, which is always a big challenge. Your book, the subtitle of your book is about organizational adaptability, how to create the workplace that is able to adapt. And there's no better time to talk about adaptability than today. You have a massive experience, both as a culture strategist in corporation and as an advisor. So can you tell us, please, about how to go about successful culture transformation?
It's a great question, and I have spent a decade of my career as an outsider, as an external management consultant, and then I moved in to be in charge of culture change within organisations in the second part of my career, and that's given me a different lens on what really works in terms of changing workplace culture. And one of the key things is you've got to see the pattern. So if you go back to the ANZ example, one of the interventions we could have taken, which many organisations take, is they go in and they say, okay, the branch staff, they're not giving good customer service, so let's put them all through a training course to make them better at customer service. Now, when we intervene in that way, what do you imagine might happen? Branch staff might get even increasingly more frustrated because they're being blamed. But instead, we stepped back from that and we saw the pattern of relatedness between the head office and the branches, and we reframed roles. So we started with the operating model, we reframed the roles of the parts, and that led to a different outcome. So I would say the first step out of my 4 steps in changing culture is to diagnose what's really going on and to really truly see those often hidden patterns behind.
So if I understand correctly, the first step is to take a deep look at the organization, analyze the current situation, analyze the underlying pattern, the invisible pattern, how people and organizations, certain parts of the organization relate to one another. That's the first step before going further. Having said that, still many culture transformation initiatives fail or don't deliver on the expected outcome. Can you please share us a couple of tips or a couple of ideas? What have you seen, why and where culture transformation initiatives may potentially go wrong?
Yes, one of the big myths, and I've talked about the 10 big myths around organisational culture, but one of the big myths I encountered a few years ago when I joined I was working at an infrastructure company within the HR department, and they had experienced a significant downturn and they were basically losing margin, and they needed to create a more commercial culture in a more competitive environment. And I was meeting with each of the executives on the top team, and one of my meetings was with the chief financial officer, and he talked to me about this need to create a more commercial culture and how significant projects were running in the red. And after about an hour, after explaining the clear need for culture change, we stood up, we shook hands, and he said, I wish you all the very best in changing the culture. So I realized in that moment that he believed that it was my job as HR and my job alone to fix the culture. And he was not alone in that assumption. That's a widely held view that it's HR's job to fix the culture. And of course, HR has a critical component to and a part to play in terms of its leadership role to bring best practice solutions, processes, and advice on how you diagnose the issues, create the change plan, and accelerate the change. But without leader-led change at all levels within the organisation, culture change will invariably fail.
What happens if the culture transformation initiative got disrupted along the way? The last 3 weeks has been a massive roller coaster ride for most organizations around the world. HR leaders are coming out as absolute heroes, being able to ensure business continuity together with the rest of the team when people are required to work in a totally different setting when we are experiencing this global pandemic. So my question is, if anyone has embarked some sort of culture transformation initiative prior the coronavirus pandemic hit, and now they are forced to be in their home office, now they are forced to work remotely in a totally different settings, what would you suggest? What to do with this culture transformation initiative? Shall we continue? Shall we have a hard stop and revisit again once the crisis is over? How shall we adapt to the current situation quickly? What is the best way to go about continuing or managing the current ongoing culture transformation initiatives?
Yeah, I think it's a really good time to take a step back onto the balcony. Really, culture has to be connected with strategy. So depending on the strategic direction or intent of the organisation, which may need to change, the culture may need to change. So, for example, in the army, the generals in the army might decide they want a disciplined culture because that will protect citizens and soldiers during wartime. Whereas the executives in a marketing firm might decide we need to double down and create an even more innovative culture. So culture can be, you could decide you want an innovative culture, a strategic culture, a customer-centric culture, a performance-driven culture, a digitally enabled culture. There are many different ways. And I also recommend people to just take this time to learn, read some books, see what you can learn. Step back and see what's on the horizon. Number one step in my book, I talk about examining what's happening internally and externally. You must keep your eye on the horizon and see how the environment is shifting in order to determine how your culture needs to shift.
This brings me to the next question which just popped in my mind about culture transformation at scale. Especially when we are experiencing such a turbulent times. Many of our viewers are, again, working from their home office and leading organizations in a virtual space. So when you are in charge of culture change in a large organization with tens of thousands of employees across borders, across continent, across cultures, what is the best way to go about culture change at scale?
One of the ways to do that is to actually move beyond just having the CEO as the leader of the culture, but start to create subgroups of leaders within the organization. So you might have the CEO and his or her direct management team, and they've got a leadership role in terms of culture and creating the culture change within their areas. But then again, you could extend that to the top 50 or the top 100 or the top 200. So each of those groups of leaders, you frame their role as culture change leaders, not just as business as usual leaders. And that's often another place where people go wrong. They don't reframe the role of leaders to lead and manage the culture change. So create subgroups of leaders extending down the organization and reframe their role as leaders of culture change.
The next question pops in my mind about sustaining culture change. What do you suggest? What's the best way to go about successfully sustaining culture change in order to help the organizations to win at the marketplace?
Yes, I always say culture is never set and forget. You never actually get there. And how, one of the things I talk about in the book is how do you keep your foot on the accelerator? For example, the ANZ Bank took 7 years. So you've got to see it as a series of sprints, not a marathon, because in a marathon, you're just going to burn yourself out. And I've seen so many leadership teams go away for 2 days to an offsite, get very excited, write lots of, ideas on flip charts and butcher's paper, and then 3 weeks later, it's fizzled out. They've lost the energy. The way to keep that energy is to limit the culture change priorities to no more than 3. If it's more than 3, people can't cope with that. So you can always have a rolling program, but reduce it to the 3 key things, get those done, move on to the next 3. And just be prepared to, see it as a series of sprints, and you have the milestones, you celebrate in between, you measure your progress with creative thinking. There's always ways to measure your progress on the culture change journey.
So this is what you're suggesting. It's a very agile way of working. We're constantly reevaluating, we're constantly learning, no more than 3, focus on no more than 3 tasks, a very iterative approach. That's basically the way to run an agile project. And of course, now it's another good reason why an organization should go for working in an agile way. My question is to you in this case, however, not every organization is currently set up to work in an agile way. So what is the best way to go about culture change then when my current structure, my current organization setting is not geared towards agile?
Yes, I think it might need some work at the senior executive team level to help those leaders to not just work on BAU, because I see a lot of leadership teams and they have their agenda and they focus on just the business as usual. This is almost dividing your agenda into, yes, there's the BAU agenda, but then there's the change agenda, our change role. Let's focus in on that. Let's see, we did something. So often leadership teams, they put in an intervention, but they don't check, how did that go? What was the response to that intervention? Did we get the desired behavior shift? What happened? What do we need to do next? What did we learn from that? So it's a very different way of interacting as a leadership team when you're going through a change initiative. It's not a technical change where you can simply pull the lever and the change happens. This produces all sorts of unintended consequences and unexpected outcomes that you need to deal with. So you need to learn as you go often. So creating that agenda where you have business as usual and then potentially you have a portion of your meetings where you talk about the change.
Absolutely, Siobhan. As we've experienced in the last 3 weeks, the speed of change is just becoming fast, it's just accelerating to an insane level. And the only thing is constant is change. So thank you so much for the fascinating insights. And if I understand correctly, your book is already out now, The Insider's Guide to Culture Change, Creating a Workplace that Delivers, Grows and Adapt. Go and grab a copy. And by the way, if people want to get in touch with you, what is the best way to reach out to you?
Best way is to connect or follow me on LinkedIn, where I post quite regularly.
So wonderful, Siobhan. Thank you so much. So look for Siobhan McHale on LinkedIn. She posts regularly some really good insights and tips about culture change. Go and grab a copy of the Insider's Guide to Culture Change. And if you like today's episode, don't forget to hit the subscribe button. Siobhan, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you.
Stay safe, Mihaly. Lovely to chat.
Really hope to see you again sometime soon in the future.